They mocked her hands for smelling of soap, but those same hands would uncover numbers no banker dared to touch. The marble floor of the Grand Meridian Bank gleamed so brightly in the early morning light that Clara Hayes could see her own reflection. It was not a reflection she often cared to study. Her hands were chapped from endless scrubbing, her nails clipped to the quick, her dress plain and washed to the point of fading. But she took pride in one thing. No surface under her care was ever left unclean. Clara had begun work before the first managers arrived, polishing brass handles and wiping down glass partitions that reflected the grandeur of a place she would never truly belong to. The bank was a fortress of wealth. Gold letters spelled the names of men who had grown fat on other people's deposits. Everywhere there were the murmurs of transactions too large for ordinary ears, the laughter of men in fine suits who had never once worried about the price of bread. And then there was Clara, invisible. She carried her bucket and rag quietly, keeping to the corners, slipping past conversations not meant for her. Sometimes she wondered if she had become more shadow than woman. The executives would stride past without a glance, their polished shoes clattering against the marble. She had been called Girl, Maid, and once, by Richard Coleman, the rising star of the bank, Soap Hands. That last one stung. Richard was the sort who wore his arrogance like a second suit. His cufflinks alone could have fed Clara's family for a month. He laughed loudest at his own jokes and never lowered his voice when speaking down to her. "Careful with that mop, Soap Hands," he said once, stepping over the freshly cleaned tiles. "You wouldn't want to ruin real work with your water stains." His colleagues laughed with him, a chorus of derision too polished to seem cruel, yet cruel all the same. Clara had bowed her head, not from shame but from restraint. Words burned in her throat, but she swallowed them. She needed the job. Her mother's medicine depended on it, and her little brother's school shoes. Still, the sting remained. Yet what Richard and the others never saw was that Clara's world was made of numbers. It had begun when she was a child. Her mother, a market vendor, had no patience for mistakes in arithmetic. "Money in, money out," she would say. "If you cannot see where a coin has gone, you have lost more than money. You have lost truth." Clara had learned to keep accounts on scraps of paper, to notice when 3 nickels were missing, to see when sums refused to balance. To her, numbers were not abstractions, but living proof of honesty. She carried that habit into her quiet life. Each evening, after finishing her shift, she would sit at the kitchen table with her brother and mark down every penny earned, every penny spent. She did not trust the fog of memory. The ledger was simple, neat, and precise. She could glance at it a week later and know exactly where a loaf of bread had gone. So it was almost natural one morning when she noticed something peculiar on the desk of an accountant as she dusted. The papers were splayed out, columns of figures written in crisp black ink. Clara did not mean to pry. She knew well enough that her place was with the rag, not with the pen. But her eyes, sharpened by years of habit, caught something out of place. A sum at the bottom of the column did not match the numbers above it. She froze, rag in hand. 12,300 plus 2,600 plus 500. She whispered the numbers to herself, adding them silently the way her mother had taught her. The total was wrong, off by nearly 1,000. At first she thought it was a mistake of her own reckoning. She did it again, slower. The error remained. It was a simple sum, no harder than the schoolwork her brother brought home. Yet someone had written it wrong, and worse still, the error tilted the numbers in a direction too neat to be accidental. Clara's heart beat faster. She looked around the empty hall. No one was there. She copied the numbers quickly on the corner of an old receipt she carried in her apron pocket. Then she returned the papers to their place and resumed dusting as though nothing had happened. All day the figures haunted her. They whispered like voices from the past, like her mother at the market stall. Money in, money out. Where has the truth gone, Clara? She thought of Richard's laughter, the disdain in his eyes whenever he looked at her. He would not care for her observation, she knew. To him, a maid's words weighed nothing, and yet the mistake sat like a stone in her chest. That evening, at her kitchen table, she laid out the receipt with the copied numbers. Her brother, curious, asked what she was doing. "Just checking something," she said softly. She added the columns again, her pencil moving with certainty. Always the same discrepancy, always the same wrong total. She could not dismiss it as carelessness. Not here, not in a bank where every figure meant trust, where the lives of families and the hopes of entire neighborhoods depended on accuracy. For the first time, Clara wondered if she was looking not at a mistake, but at a wound, one carefully hidden under neat ink, one that someone hoped no one would notice. In the hush of the night, with only the ticking clock and the hum of the street outside, Clara's decision formed. She was not educated in the way Richard Coleman was. She had no degree, no tie, no polished shoes, but she had truth in numbers. And numbers, she knew, had a way of speaking louder than any man's laughter. That night she folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into the pages of her own worn ledger. It was nothing more than a fragment, a whisper, but she sensed it would not be the last. The bank was filled with columns and rows, with ledgers stacked like walls, with numbers that could either stand as pillars of trust or collapse like lies. And if those pillars were weak, someone had to see it. Clara had not asked for that task, but perhaps, without knowing, she had been preparing for it all her life. As she extinguished the lamp, she whispered into the darkness, "Numbers don't lie." And in that moment, though no one knew it yet, the fate of the bank began to shift, not because of the wealthy men in suits, but because of the maid they mocked, whose soap-scented hands carried the weight of truth. He laughed at her as if laughter were a law. She answered with the one law he could not bend: the sum must be true. The next morning, Clara Hayes entered the Grand Meridian Bank carrying her mop and bucket the way a soldier carries his weapon, with quiet duty, never with pride. She moved through the lobby before most of the clerks had settled at their desks. The marble reflected her every step, a reminder of how small she looked in a place built for people who would never know her name. But Clara's mind was not on her work. It was still tangled with the numbers she had seen the day before. That single sum, wrong by 780, had echoed all through the night. She had written it again and again in her notebook, checked it until her hands ached. Numbers had no malice. They only revealed, and what they revealed here, she could not forget. By mid-morning, the bank was in full rhythm. Phones ringing, printers spitting out sheets of transactions, clerks rushing with armfuls of ledgers. Clara was dusting a row of brass lamps on the second floor when Richard Coleman came striding down the corridor. Behind him trailed two younger associates, laughing before he even opened his mouth. Richard's voice had a way of filling every corner, as if silence itself owed him attention. He spotted Clara immediately. A grin tugged at his mouth. "Careful there, soap hands," he said. "That lamp costs more than your annual wage. Don't polish the numbers off it." The men at his side laughed. Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her hands steady on the lamp. She had heard such words often enough, but never had they struck her so cruelly as now, because she carried in her apron pocket the proof that the men in suits, with all their education and arrogance, had stumbled over the simplest arithmetic. Richard swept past her and into his office. He pulled a thick binder of accounts onto the desk with a flourish. As he spread the pages, one sheet slipped loose and floated to the floor, landing at Clara's feet. Out of habit, she bent to pick it up. The numbers glared up at her, neatly typed, confident in their black ink. And there it was again, the wrong sum, like a scar that no one wanted to see. Clara's lips moved before she could stop them. "This total is off," she whispered. Then louder, almost against her will, "It's short by 780. The words fell into the room like a stone into still water. The associates froze. Richard turned slowly, disbelief etched on his face. For a moment he said nothing. Then his lips curled into a sneer. "Our maid has opinions now," he said. "Tell me, do you also balance the world economy between scrubbing the floors?" The men laughed again, but not as heartily as before. Clara held the page toward him, her hand trembling only slightly. "It's not an opinion, sir," she said softly. "It's just addition. 3 numbers don't equal the total written here. Anyone can check it." Her voice was calm, but her heart pounded. She expected him to snatch the sheet, to see the truth, and go silent. Instead, Richard threw back his head and laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that made the associates' chuckles rise nervously to match. "Addition, she says," he roared. "Gentlemen, we are blessed. A maid with a gift for schoolhouse sums. Next, she'll teach us all about interest rates." The laughter echoed, but Clara noticed one of the associates glance down at the page with a frown. His lips moved as he quickly added the figures. His eyes widened slightly, though he said nothing. Clara lowered her gaze. The humiliation burned, but beneath it was something steadier, certainty. Numbers did not bow to laughter. They stood like stones in a river, unshaken by the water rushing past. She gathered her bucket and cloth, turned, and walked out without another word. The corridor outside felt cooler, quieter, yet her heart still beat with the echo of Richard's mockery. She passed a glass-walled conference room where Eleanor Brooks, the director, stood with a group of managers. For an instant, Eleanor's eyes met hers, sharp, assessing, not unkind. Then the moment was gone, and Clara moved on. Downstairs in the staff lounge, she poured herself a glass of water. 2 junior clerks were talking nearby. "Coleman's got a big presentation Friday," one said. "Yeah, he's pushing to oversee the community fund directly. Wants to show the board he can make it more efficient." The others smirked. Efficient usually means less for the people who need it. Clara turned away before they noticed her listening. The word efficient rattled in her mind. If efficiency meant rounding numbers, hiding sums, making money vanish in columns and reappear in pockets, then she knew what it was worth. That night at home, Clara laid out the slip of paper beside yesterday's notes. Her brother peered over her shoulder. "Is it trouble?" he asked. "It's numbers," she said. Numbers don't mean trouble by themselves, but people can make them dangerous. She traced the columns again. Always the same error, always the same arrogance covering it. She remembered Richard's laughter, how easily the room had followed it, how fragile truth had seemed in that instant. Yet she also remembered the look on the young associate's face when he realized she was right. Truth had been planted. Small, perhaps invisible now, but seeds always grow. Later that night, far across town, Richard Coleman held court at an expensive restaurant. Glasses clinked, candles flickered. He told a story about the cleaning girl who corrected my math, and the table erupted with laughter. But even as they laughed, one man at the edge of the group did not join in. He had seen the numbers. He had seen the error. Richard did not notice. He believed laughter was stronger than truth. But Clara Hayes, alone at her kitchen table with her modest lamp and her worn ledger, knew otherwise. Numbers did not bend. They waited, patient and certain, until someone brave enough held them up to the light. And though Richard's voice rang louder now, Clara knew the day would come when his laughter would not be enough. The third morning began like all the others. The marble floor gleamed, the air smelled faintly of polished brass and bitter coffee, and the bankers moved with their usual arrogance, as though the city existed only to serve their ledgers. To Clara Hayes, every surface was a mirror of disdain. She wiped fingerprints no one thanked her for, polished handles that no one noticed, and carried a silence heavy as the bucket at her side. But beneath her silence, something had shifted. Ever since Richard Coleman had mocked her correction, Clara felt the numbers calling her back, whispering from behind the ink. She could not escape them. At home, she had written them again and again, each digit like a stone in her pocket. And now, as she moved between the offices, she felt that same pull, as though truth itself had chosen her as its reluctant messenger. It happened in Richard's office. The man himself was not yet there. His desk, however, was strewn with papers. Clara hesitated at the doorway. She knew her role: dust, polish, vanish. But the sight of the open ledger, tilted slightly off the desk's edge, stopped her. It looked abandoned, careless, almost begging for hands to restore it. She set down her rag and gently lifted the heavy book. Its leather binding was warm from the morning sun. She straightened it, opened it to settle the pages flat. And then her eyes, trained by years of humble accounting at her mother's stall, saw what no educated banker had cared to notice. The numbers were wrong. Not only wrong, consistent in their wrongness. First, a line of small expenditures for supplies. Individually, they seemed harmless. But Clara added them as she always did, whispering under her breath, 230 plus 95 plus 140? The total written in ink was lower than her sum, lower by the same neat pattern she had seen before. Her hands tightened on the edge of the desk. She turned the page. Again, donations entered twice under slightly altered names. She recognized the trick. Community Health Initiative on one line, Communal Health Initiative on another, both credited as separate. The totals merged at the bottom, adjusted downward with a flourish of pen. Clara's breath caught. It was not a mistake. It was a design. She pressed her palms to the ledger as though to still the beating of her heart. Her mother's voice echoed from years ago, firm as iron. If money cannot be traced, then honesty cannot be trusted. Never let the numbers lie, Clara. She had always believed numbers were clean, incorruptible, but here they were being bent like metal in a dishonest hand. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. Clara nearly dropped the ledger. She scrambled, placing it exactly as she had found it, cloth in hand, pretending to polish the desk just as Richard Coleman entered with his usual self-importance. He barely looked at her. He walked straight to the desk, signed something with a sharp stroke, and muttered about the board meeting. Clara stepped back, but in her apron pocket she clutched a small scrap of paper. She had copied one of the suspicious totals before closing the book. Richard glanced up at her then, his eyes narrowing. "You again," he said coldly. "What is it this time? Another lesson in arithmetic?" Clara lowered her head. "No, sir." He smirked. "Good. Keep it that way. This is not a classroom for cleaning girls." The words were knives, but Clara held her silence. She finished dusting quickly and slipped from the room, her heart pounding. That evening at her kitchen table, Clara unfolded the slip of paper. Her brother leaned over, curiously, chewing on a crust of bread. "What are you always writing?" he asked. Clara pointed to the numbers. "Look, if you add these three, you should get 565. But see, they wrote 490. That's not a mistake. That's a hand guiding the total downward." The boy frowned. "Why would someone do that?" "Because every missing coin has to land somewhere," Clara whispered. "And sometimes it lands in pockets that don't deserve it." She felt the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She had uncovered something dangerous. If she stayed silent, she was complicit. If she spoke, she risked her job, her mother's medicine, her brother's school. Yet the numbers burned in her mind, relentless. The next morning, Clara moved through the bank with sharper eyes. Every desk she passed, every ledger half open, she noticed small inconsistencies, rounded figures, doubled names, misplaced decimals. The pattern was everywhere, like cracks spreading in the foundation of a grand house. In the break room, two clerks whispered nervously, "They're saying Coleman's fund is outperforming projections." Outperforming or disguising? Clara turned away before they saw her listening, but her heart raced. She was not the only one sensing deceit. By the week's end, Clara had gathered 3 slips of copied numbers, each pointing to the same trail. Funds siphoned, accounts twisted, sums that betrayed the very trust they pretended to uphold. She hid the scraps in her worn ledger at home. Looking at them, she whispered a vow to herself. "I may be a maid, but truth doesn't care who holds it. I will not let these numbers vanish." Outside her window, the city roared with life, horses clattering, children shouting, merchants bargaining. But inside Clara's small room, there was only the stillness of ink on paper, the silent testimony of numbers no one else dared to see. Thus, what began as a single slip of arithmetic had become a trail, and Clara Hayes, the girl with soap-scented hands, now carried a secret that could unmake the pride of powerful men. And though she walked into the bank each morning with her bucket and rag, invisible to all, inside she knew she was standing at the edge of a storm. The days at Grand Meridian Bank followed their well-rehearsed rhythm. Doors opened at 9, shoes clicked across marble, voices dropped into the serious hush of money-exchanging hands. To most, it was a place of authority, where numbers carried certainty and men in pressed suits ruled like minor kings. But to Clara Hayes, who swept its corridors with rag and bucket, the bank had become a theater of whispers. Every sum she glimpsed, every misplaced decimal seemed to murmur the same truth. Something was wrong. It was not dramatic at first. No bold theft, no scandal written in red ink, just small, persistent errors, always in the same direction, always subtracting from the honest total. Like water dripping unseen through a ceiling, each one seemed minor, but together they could rot the beams of the entire house. That morning, Clara moved quietly through Richard Coleman's office while he was away at a meeting. On the desk lay another ledger. She told herself she would only straighten the papers, only dust the edges. Yet her eyes betrayed her hands. They skimmed the columns as if guided by instinct, and there it was again, the same whisper of deceit. A list of maintenance costs. 3 entries, 220, 310, 75. Added together, they should have been 605. The written total declared 545. Clara froze. She whispered the numbers again, almost like a prayer, each digit steady and familiar. Her breath tightened. It was not a mistake. Mistakes stumble in all directions. These errors leaned always toward subtraction, toward disappearance. She copied the figures quickly onto a folded receipt and slipped it into her apron. Her fingers trembled as she wiped the desk clean, her heart pounding with the knowledge that each line she saw was a brick in a wall of fraud. At lunch, while other staff laughed over sandwiches in the lounge, Clara sat alone on a bench near the service dock. She unfolded the slip and checked the sum again. Her mother's voice returned to her, stern yet steady. "Money in, money out. If the totals do not match, the truth is hiding." Truth was hiding here. And Clara was the only one listening. Mr. Ortega, the porter, passed by with his cart. He paused when he saw the look on her face. "You carry numbers like they weigh more than buckets," he said gently. "They do," Clara whispered. "They weigh more than marble floors or brass doors. They carry what's honest." Ortega gave her a long look. "Be careful, Nina. When numbers tell the truth Those who prefer lies will not thank you for it. That evening at home, Clara laid out her scraps of paper across the kitchen table. Her brother leaned closer, eyes wide. "You've been finding more?" he asked. She nodded. "Every day. The sums keep bending in the same direction." "Then you should tell someone." She shook her head. "If I accuse a man like Richard Coleman, who will believe me? I am a maid." "He is the rising star of this bank." Her brother frowned. "But the numbers don't lie." Clara smiled sadly. "No, they don't. But men do. And sometimes their lies are louder." The next morning, Richard himself nearly caught her. She was dusting the conference room when he entered, his voice booming with self-importance. He strode to the whiteboard, marker in hand, preparing for his presentation. Clara kept her head bowed, cloth moving in steady circles. On the board, he scrawled totals with sweeping confidence. Clara's eyes flicked up just once. The sum at the bottom. Again, it was wrong. Not by much, only a few hundred, but enough. The whisper was there, repeating itself. She wanted to speak, to correct him, to force the room into silence with nothing more than arithmetic. But she remembered the last time. The laughter, the sneers, the humiliation. Her throat tightened. She wiped the table harder as if scrubbing away her own urge to speak. Richard turned suddenly. "You there, done yet?" "Yes, sir," she said quietly, gathering her things. "Then be quick. Important men have real work to do." His words cut, but Clara walked out in silence. Yet inside, the whisper of the wrong sum had grown louder. Later that week, Eleanor Brooks, the bank's director, called a brief staff assembly. Clara listened from the back, invisible as always. Eleanor spoke of transparency, of efficiency, of trust. Her voice was calm, but edged with warning. Clara watched the room carefully. Richard stood near the front, his shoulders squared, his face fixed in confidence. But Clara saw the slight twitch at his jaw when Eleanor emphasized the word integrity. It was then that Clara understood. The fraud was not only in numbers, it was in pride, in the arrogance that thought no one would notice. But she noticed. That night, Clara made a decision. She gathered her slips of paper, each one carrying the evidence of small lies. She copied them neatly into her own worn ledger, the one she had used for years to record bread, medicine, and rent. Line by line, she wrote, 3 entries, 2 and 20, 310, 75. Total claimed, 545. Correct total, 605. 2 donations, Community Health Initiative and Commonwealth Health Initiative, both credited separately. 3 small supplies listed, total understated by $780. The pages of her humble ledger now carried the weight of truth the bank's grand ledgers had abandoned. She closed the book, pressed her hand against its cover, and whispered, "Numbers don't lie. And if they whisper, I will listen." The fraud was still a whisper in the halls of the bank, easily drowned by Richard Coleman's laughter and the clatter of polished shoes. But whispers grow. They gather, echo, and one day become thunder. And Clara Hayes, the maid mocked for her soap-scented hands, was now the keeper of a secret that could shake marble walls. The grand hallway of the Meridian gleamed like a cathedral to money. Chandeliers spilled golden light across marble floors, and portraits of stern-faced financiers stared down from paneled walls. Normally, Clara Hayes slipped through this hall like a shadow, head bowed, mop in hand, while bankers marched past in their suits, speaking in sums that never included her. But that morning, she found herself standing at its very center, holding nothing more than a folded slip of paper, her heart hammering like it wanted to break free from her chest. The board meeting had just ended, and Richard Coleman was surrounded by colleagues, his voice booming as he paraded his so-called success. Efficiency, gentlemen, efficiency. You cannot argue with the numbers. Look at these totals. Proof that our fund grows leaner, sharper, better directed. They laughed, nodding in approval. His confidence was a cloak, dazzling in its brightness. Clara had not meant to linger, but as she wiped the brass handles at the edge of the hall, her eyes caught the pages Richard waved in his hand. Columns of figures, tallies, totals. She had seen them before. And her pulse quickened, because once again, the numbers betrayed him. The sum at the bottom was wrong. Not by a great margin, but enough to show the pattern repeating. Always in the same direction, always subtracting. The whisper she had been carrying for days now swelled into a shout in her chest. For a moment, she hesitated. She could stay silent, finish her work, walk away. It was safer that way. But then she thought of her mother, bent over a market stall, saying, "If you let numbers lie, you let truth die." She thought of her little brother, who deserved a world where honesty mattered more than arrogance. Her hand trembled, but she stepped forward. "Sir," she said softly. At first, no one turned. She raised her voice. "Sir, that total you showed, it does not add up." The sound of her words cracked through the hallway like glass breaking. Laughter faltered. Heads turned. Richard lowered his papers slowly, his eyes narrowing as he recognized her. "It's you again," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "The cleaning girl with soap on her hands and sums in her head." Snickers rippled through the crowd. Richard held the paper up like a trophy. "You claim this is wrong? These totals have been reviewed by auditors, signed by men whose shoes you couldn't polish." Clara's voice shook, but it did not break. She stepped closer. 2,100 plus 1,300 plus 620. The sum is 4,020, but you have written 3,890. The hall went still. One of the younger associates frowned, mouthing the numbers silently. His brow furrowed. She's right," he whispered. Richard's jaw tightened. He gave a short, sharp laugh. "Gentlemen, do you hear this? Our maid corrects us again. Perhaps she thinks she should sit at the table instead of cleaning beneath it." He expected the room to join his laughter, but the echo never came. Instead, there was silence. Thick, uneasy silence, as several men now glanced down at their copies of the report. Pens scratched hastily across paper. Murmurs spread like smoke. Clara held her folded slip tighter. Her knees trembled, but her eyes did not lower. "Numbers do not care who speaks them," she said quietly. "They only tell the truth." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Eleanor Brooks, the director, stepped into the hall. She had heard the commotion from the meeting room. Her gaze swept across the group until it landed on Clara. "What is this?" Eleanor asked sharply. Richard straightened. "Nothing but nonsense, Madam Director. This girl—" "She is correct," one of the clerks blurted out, holding his notes. "The totals don't match. It's exactly as she said." A ripple ran through the hall. Richard's face flushed crimson. "A clerical oversight," he snapped. "An error in transcription." But Eleanor's eyes did not leave Clara. They were sharp, searching, as if trying to pierce the veil of silence the maid had lived behind. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice low but firm. "Numbers do not make the same mistake twice, Mr. Coleman. We will review this." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Eleanor had already turned away. The meeting was over, and the power of his laughter had broken like cheap glass. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring in low voices. Some cast Clara quick, curious glances, as though seeing her for the first time. She did not bask in their stares. She only felt the pounding of her heart and the weight of her own trembling hands. She returned to her cleaning cart, but she knew nothing would ever be the same again. She had spoken the truth aloud, and it had silenced the laughter of men who thought themselves untouchable. That night at home, Clara wrote carefully in her ledger. Confronted the error in the hall. They laughed, then they listened. Truth has a voice, even in the mouth of a maid. Her brother looked up from his homework. Were you scared? Yes, Clara admitted. Terrified. Then why did you do it? Because silence would have been worse, she whispered. She closed the ledger and blew out the lamp. For the first time in weeks, her sleep was dreamless. The numbers had spoken and the world had been forced to hear. But deep inside, she knew the fight was only beginning. The morning after the confrontation, the air inside Grand Meridian Bank felt strangely heavy, as though the chandeliers themselves remembered what had been said. Clara Hayes walked her usual path with mop and cloth in hand, but every step was accompanied by the echo of yesterday, her voice correcting the sum, Richard Coleman's forced laughter, the silence that followed. She had not wanted that moment. She had not planned it. But truth has its own weight, and sometimes it presses so hard that silence breaks. Now, eyes followed her more than before. Clerks who once brushed past her without notice glanced at her, quickly looking away when she met their gaze. Some seemed curious, some cautious. A few, she thought, even respectful. But others, those who laughed too loudly near Richard's side, looked at her with scorn, as though she had disturbed a natural order. In Richard Coleman's office, the storm brewed. He slammed the ledger shut so hard that the pen jar rattled. She embarrassed me, he growled. His associates stood uneasily. A maid, nothing but a maid, corrected me in front of the director. Do you understand what this means? One of the men spoke timidly. Sir, perhaps it really was just a clerical error. Richard's glare silenced him. There are no errors in my reports. Do you hear me? None. She wants to play accountant? Fine. Let's see how long she lasts. His laughter this time was not proud, but bitter, forced, like metal scraping metal. That afternoon, Clara was assigned to clean the long hallway outside the boardroom again. As she bent to polish the brass railings, she heard voices carrying through the heavy oak door. Eleanor Brooks, the director, was speaking. Integrity is not optional. If these numbers falter, our entire reputation collapses. I will not allow this institution to rot from within. There was silence. Then Richard's voice answered, strained but confident. With respect, Madam Director, you cannot trust the words of a maid over the expertise of a banker. She misread the totals. I assure you our records are clean. Clara froze. Her hands tightened around the cloth. Eleanor replied, voice cool, I will decide what is clean, Mr. Coleman. And for now, I will keep both eyes open. Clara's heart raced. She returned to her work, careful not to be heard. But she knew then that her small correction had not been dismissed. It lingered in the director's mind like a seed waiting to sprout. That evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table, her ledger open. The scraps of copied figures lay spread before her like puzzle pieces. Her brother leaned in, eyes wide. Did they listen to you again today? He asked. Not yet, Clara said softly. But silence can mean more than laughter. Yesterday they laughed. Today they are quiet. That is how truth grows, first mocked, then resisted, then feared. Her brother frowned. Aren't you scared, Clara? She smiled faintly. Terrified. But numbers don't care if I'm afraid. They only care if they are true. She copied another suspicious total she had seen that day. Two identical entries under slightly different names merged into one understated sum. She wrote it carefully into her ledger, the ink steady, even as her hands trembled. The next day, a small crowd gathered in the hallway outside the boardroom. Richard was presenting again, waving his reports. Clara passed with her cart, invisible as ever, until Richard's voice rang out. "And here, gentlemen, is proof that our expenses have been reduced by 12%. Efficiency at its finest." He tapped the paper, smiling broadly. Laughter rose from his allies. But then a whisper moved through the room. One of the younger clerks muttered, "The sum's wrong again." Another checked quickly, then nodded. A ripple of murmurs spread. Richard's smile faltered. "What is it now?" he demanded. The director's eyes narrowed. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. The clerks exchanged glances. Finally, one spoke. "Yes, Madam Director. The sum is understated by nearly 200. The hall went dead silent. Clara, standing in the corner with her mop, felt her heart thunder. She had not spoken this time. Others had seen it themselves. Her small voice had become a lens through which others now looked. Richard's face turned red. He stammered, searching for excuses, but the silence in the room was louder than his words. That night, Clara could barely sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in her mind. The laughter that once drowned her had withered into silence. Silence was dangerous, yes, but it was also powerful. It meant doubt had taken root. She whispered into the darkness, as if to the numbers themselves, "You are not mine, but I will carry you, even if it costs me everything." The Grand Meridian Bank still sparkled with wealth, still dressed itself in marble and gold. But beneath its polished surface, unease had begun to spread. Clerks whispered behind closed doors. Reports were double-checked. And in the center of it all was a maid with soap-scented hands, who had spoken only what was true. The laughter was gone. In its place, silence grew, and silence, Clara knew, was only the beginning. The bank did not change overnight. To the wealthy clients who swept through its marble halls, Grand Meridian still glittered with certainty. But to Clara Hayes, who carried her mop along those same corridors, the air had grown heavy. She could feel it, like a storm waiting beyond the windows. Each day, she saw it more clearly. The mistakes were no longer isolated. They were connected, like stones laid to form a path. At first, she thought it was chance, an error here, a slip there. But the repetition spoke differently. The numbers bent in the same direction, as if guided by an unseen hand. It began with the community fund. Clara found herself dusting near a clerk's desk while he stepped away. The ledger lay open, and her eyes, trained by habit, landed on the totals. The donations listed, 3,000, 4,500, 620, should have reached over 8,000. Yet the sum written at the bottom was lower, trimmed neatly by hundreds. Her chest tightened. She copied it onto a scrap of paper, hiding it in her apron. That evening at her kitchen table, she laid it beside the others. 4 scraps now, each showing the same pattern. Subtractions, repetition, intent. Her brother frowned as he peered at the growing pile. "Clara, these aren't just mistakes." She nodded. "No, they are threads, and when threads gather, they form a rope someone is using to pull money away." The next morning, Clara lingered longer than usual in the archive room. Few came there, only the occasional junior staff carrying files. The shelves smelled of dust and ink. On a desk sat a stack of expense sheets waiting to be sorted. She picked one up under the pretense of wiping the table. Her breath caught. The page listed supplies purchased 3 times in 1 week from 3 vendors with nearly identical names. The handwriting looked too neat, too deliberate. She whispered the totals to herself, adding them twice to be sure. Again, the bottom number fell short of the truth. She pressed her palm to the page as if to feel its dishonesty. Then she copied the figures quickly, sliding the scrap into her pocket before footsteps approached. That evening, her ledger grew heavier. She now had 7 scraps. Soon, Clara realized the scope. It was not just a handful of sums. The wrong numbers appeared across departments: supplies, donations, maintenance. The pattern was always the same: round down the totals, double the names, shift a decimal. Small, careful steps, but together they carved out large absences. She whispered it to herself late at night, staring at her ledger. This is not carelessness. This is theft. Her brother looked up from his schoolwork. But who, Clara? Who is doing it? She hesitated. The answer pressed against her lips, but fear sealed them shut. She had seen Richard Coleman's hand on more than one of the ledgers, his voice, his arrogance, his insistence that she stay silent. But accusing him outright, without proof strong enough to crush his laughter, would be dangerous. Not yet, she told her brother softly. But the trail leads somewhere, and I will follow. The trail led deeper than she expected. One afternoon, while polishing the glass partitions of the conference room, she saw Richard presenting again. Charts glowed on the board behind him, numbers marching like soldiers across the screen. He spoke of efficiency, of success, of growth. But Clara's eyes darted to a single line at the bottom corner. An expense claim. It looked harmless, buried beneath the rest. Yet the name of the vendor was one she had seen before, slightly altered, almost identical to another she had copied. Her pulse raced. The trail was no longer just in ledgers. It had reached the grand stage of presentations. He was building his triumph on lies. She bent her head and wiped the glass harder, hiding the intensity in her eyes. She could not speak yet, but she copied the name silently onto her cloth with the tip of her finger, repeating it until it etched itself into memory. That night, Clara laid out all her scraps. 10 slips of paper now, each bearing figures that did not belong. She arranged them like puzzle pieces across the table. Her brother watched silently, sensing the weight of her work. At last, Clara leaned back, her breath trembling. "Do you see?" she whispered. "It is all connected. Small numbers, hidden in different places. But together," she tapped the pages, "together, they are not hundreds, they are thousands. And soon, they will be millions." Her brother's eyes widened. "And Richard?" She closed her ledger slowly, her face set with quiet resolve. "He thinks no one notices. He thinks laughter can drown truth, but numbers do not fear laughter. They only wait for someone to count them." The next day, Eleanor Brooks called another meeting. Clara was not inside, but she lingered nearby with her cleaning cart, listening through the crack of the door. Eleanor's voice was sharp. "These discrepancies cannot be dismissed. I want every department rechecked, line by line." Richard's tone answered, defensive, almost desperate. "With respect, Madam Director, these are trifles, oversights. We cannot waste time chasing ghosts." Clara's hands tightened on the handle of her mop. Ghosts, he called them. But she knew the truth. The ghosts were real, and they wore the shape of numbers. That evening, Clara added a final note to her ledger. She wrote carefully, the words steady as stone. The sums whisper louder now. They form a trail, leading to something vast. I will follow, no matter where it ends. She closed the book, pressing her hand against it as though sealing a vow. The hidden trail had begun with one wrong sum. Now it stretched before her like a road paved in lies. And Clara Hayes, the maid with soap-scented hands, walked it alone toward a truth that could shatter the walls of Grand Meridian. The boardroom had never felt so heavy. The long mahogany table gleamed under the light of crystal chandeliers, papers spread like weapons across its surface. Men and women in fine suits whispered uneasily, their pens tapping against leather folders. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Brooks, her sharp gaze cutting through the silence. And there, standing before them with his usual air of triumph, was Richard Coleman. His shoulders were squared, his chin tilted upward, his voice booming as if authority itself lived inside his throat. But beneath the practiced smile, something strained. For weeks, Clara Hayes had watched from the margins, her eyes collecting whispers from the ledgers, her hands carrying the truth in hidden scraps of paper. Now that truth had finally risen to the table where power sat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard declared, flipping through his reports, "our fund's efficiency speaks for itself. We have reduced expenses, streamlined accounts, and ensured this bank remains a model of trust." The words rang hollow. Eleanor's fingers tapped once on the polished table. "Then explain these discrepancies." She nodded to a clerk, who slid forward a stack of corrected figures. Every line Clara had whispered into her private ledger now lay printed in black and white. Totals understated, vendors duplicated, decimals misplaced. The boardroom rustled with unease. Richard's smile faltered. He picked up the sheets, scanning quickly. His face flushed. "Clerical errors," he muttered. "Small things, trifles. They do not alter the larger truth of our success." "Numbers are not trifles, Mr. Coleman," Eleanor said coolly. "They are the foundation. If the foundation cracks, the whole structure falls." The silence that followed was sharper than any laughter Clara had endured. Clara stood just outside the glass wall, polishing the handles with deliberate slowness. Her ears caught every word. She could not see the expressions, but she could imagine them. The unease in the junior clerks, the dawning realization in the older men who had long trusted Richard's bravado. Richard's voice rose again, desperate. "We cannot expect perfection in every line. The staff handles thousands of entries. Naturally, some small slips occur." One of the clerks, emboldened, spoke up. "But sir, the errors all lean the same way. Always subtracting, always reducing the totals." The words cut deeper than any blade. Murmurs swelled. Richard slammed his palm against the table. "Do you question my integrity?" Eleanor's voice sliced through the tension. "It is not your integrity we question, Mr. Coleman. It is your numbers. And numbers, unlike men, do not defend themselves with volume." Outside, Clara's rag trembled in her hands. She remembered how Richard had laughed at her, how his voice had filled halls with scorn. Now that same voice shook like a faltering wall. She whispered to herself, "The numbers are louder than his pride." The meeting dragged on. Richard attempted charts, explanations, elaborate words meant to cloud simple truths. But every time he lifted a page, Eleanor countered with corrected sums. Each correction chipped away at him until even his laughter, once booming and cruel, sounded brittle. Finally, one of the board members leaned back and said quietly, "If a maid could see what our banker could not, then perhaps it is not the maid who should be ashamed." The words dropped like stones into the silence. Richard's face blanched. For the first time in his career, his pride, his shield, his weapon, his mask, cracked. He shuffled his papers with shaking hands, muttering excuses no one believed. That evening, Clara returned home exhausted. She sat at her kitchen table with her ledger open, her brother beside her. "Did he laugh at you again?" the boy asked. Clara shook her head slowly. "No, Not this time. His laughter is gone. Her brother looked puzzled. Then what's left? Silence, Clara said. She touched the scraps of paper gently. And fear. Not mine. His. The next day, Richard entered the bank later than usual. His suit was pressed as always, but his steps lacked their former swagger. When he passed Clara in the hall, he did not speak. For the first time, he did not even look at her. His pride had collapsed inward, like a roof no longer able to hold its weight. Around him, whispers grew. Clerks no longer rushed to laugh at his jokes. Associates kept their distance. Even the walls seemed to echo differently when he spoke. And Clara, though she remained invisible to most, carried herself a little taller. Not with arrogance, but with the quiet strength of someone who had listened to the whispers of truth and dared to repeat them aloud. In her ledger that night she wrote, "The proud fall, not in storms, but in silence. The numbers I carried have spoken. His voice no longer drowns them." She closed the book, knowing the battle was not yet finished. Richard was wounded, but pride is stubborn. He would fight to protect himself, and Clara, armed with nothing but arithmetic and courage, would have to be ready. For the trail was not done, and the collapse of pride was only the beginning of the reckoning to come. The marble halls of Grand Meridian still shone as if nothing had changed. But everyone who worked within them felt the shift. The air no longer carried the easy laughter of Richard Coleman. It carried whispers, questions muttered in corners, doubts written across uneasy faces. Pride had collapsed, and in its place remained a silence waiting to be filled. Clara Hayes walked those halls as she always had, bucket in one hand, cloth in the other. Yet now, the eyes that passed her seemed different. Some glanced with caution, others with quiet respect. The very people who once dismissed her as invisible now carried the memory of her voice correcting sums in front of them all. She did not walk taller. She did not need to. It was enough that truth itself had lifted her. The board convened again 3 days later, and this time the air was sharper. Eleanor Brooks presided with measured calm. On the table lay a pile of corrected reports, every one of them checked, rechecked, and aligned with the hidden slips Clara had been carrying for weeks. Richard sat near the end of the table. His shoulders, once squared in arrogance, now sagged beneath invisible weight. His face was pale, his fingers restless against his pen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor began, her voice steady, "we have reviewed the discrepancies. They were not oversights. They were patterns. Patterns designed to disguise theft." The room stirred uneasily. Richard cleared his throat, attempting his old bravado. "Madam Director, with respect, surely you cannot accept the word of a maid over the expertise of—" "Enough," Eleanor cut him off, her voice slicing through his protest. "The word is not hers. It is the numbers. And numbers do not lie." Silence settled. Papers rustled. Heads nodded. Clara was outside the glass wall, polishing as always. She tried to keep her eyes low, but her ears caught every syllable. She expected to hear more denial, more laughter. Instead, she heard something else. Recognition. One of the senior board members leaned forward, his tone heavy with reluctant respect. "If not for the maid, we would never have noticed. She saw what we refused to see. She saved us from scandal." The words struck Clara harder than any insult Richard had ever thrown. She paused, cloth frozen mid-air. Saved us. The phrase did not belong to someone like her, and yet it was true. Richard slammed his hand against the table. "You would trust her? A woman who scrubs your floors?" The senior member met his gaze. "Yes, because she can add." The room erupted, not in laughter this time, but in agreement. Murmurs rose, voices layering until Richard's protest drowned beneath them. Eleanor's voice steadied the storm. We owe this institution's survival not to pride, but to vigilance. And in this case, vigilance came from the most unlikely place. She turned her eyes toward the glass wall where Clara stood frozen. For the first time, Eleanor gestured. Bring her in. Clara's heart stopped. She looked around, as if Eleanor might mean someone else, but the director's gaze did not shift. Slowly, uncertainly, Clara stepped into the boardroom. The space felt enormous, every polished surface reflecting her plain dress, her soap-stained hands. She wanted to shrink back into silence, but Eleanor's voice anchored her. Miss Hayes, Eleanor said, you saw what others ignored. You spoke when others laughed. Do you understand what that means? Clara swallowed hard. It means numbers don't bend, ma'am, even if people do. A ripple moved through the room, soft gasps, murmurs of agreement. For once, Clara's words were not dismissed. They were heard. Richard surged to his feet, his face twisted. This is absurd! You cannot elevate a maid over bankers, you cannot— Eleanor raised a hand, silencing him. Sit down, Mr. Coleman. The matter is no longer yours to command. Richard hesitated, then collapsed into his chair. His pride was gone, his allies scattered. And Clara, who had once been mocked as nothing more than soap hands, now stood where his voice had failed. Eleanor turned back to Clara. You may not wear a suit, but you carry something rarer, integrity. This bank owes you its gratitude. Clara's throat tightened. She had not sought gratitude, she had only sought truth. Yet in that moment she felt the weight of every long night hunched over her mother's market stall, every scrap of paper she had copied in secret. The world finally saw her, not as invisible, but as essential. That evening, Clara walked home slowly, the city lights glowing softer than usual. Her brother ran to the door when she arrived. Did they listen? He asked breathlessly. Clara knelt beside him, smiling through tears she hadn't realized were there. Yes, they listened. And they believed you? She nodded. They believed the numbers. Her brother hugged her tightly. For the first time in years, Clara felt her mother's words come alive in her chest. Money in, money out. If the numbers don't match, speak. Always speak. The next morning, as she entered the bank, something remarkable happened. The clerks who once ignored her nodded respectfully. One even held the door open. She did not bask in it, but her heart warmed quietly. Respect was not what she had sought, yet it was what truth had brought. In her small ledger at home that night, she wrote a single line. The maid they mocked has become the witness they cannot dismiss. Truth is heavy, but it lifts. And though Clara knew battles still lay ahead, that pride, greed, and arrogance would not vanish in a single day, she also knew something had changed forever. The recognition had come, not from where she expected, but from where it mattered most, the very heart of the institution that once silenced her. And in that recognition, Clara Hayes discovered that even the humblest voice can steady the world when it speaks with the certainty of numbers. The Grand Meridian Bank had always measured its wealth in glittering chandeliers and gleaming ledgers, in vaults filled with gold and numbers that danced across polished reports. But in the weeks following the confrontation, its wealth came to mean something else, something quieter, deeper, and infinitely harder to counterfeit. It meant integrity. And that integrity had been restored not by the proud bankers who wore silk ties, but by the maid whose hands still smelled faintly of soap. Clara Hayes continued her work as always. Each morning she polished brass, wiped marble floors, and carried her bucket through corridors where she once walked invisible. But now, heads lifted when she passed. Clerks who once ignored her now greeted her with quiet respect. Even the most senior board members nodded when they saw her. It was not fame. It was not riches. It was recognition. The kind that could not be bought. Richard Coleman, stripped of his pride, no longer filled the halls with laughter. The board suspended him, his reports seized, his accounts examined line by line. His arrogance, once so untouchable, now looked fragile, almost pitiful. Clara felt no triumph in his fall, only a solemn confirmation that numbers had spoken louder than pride. One morning, Eleanor Brooks asked Clara to step into her office. The room was lined with shelves of thick law books and financial records, but the director's gaze softened when she looked at the maid. "Miss Hayes," she said, "we cannot undo the way you were treated here. But we can acknowledge what you have done. You saved this institution from disgrace. Without you, the truth might never have been heard." Clara lowered her eyes. "I only added the sums, ma'am. Anyone could have done it." Eleanor leaned forward. "But no one else did. That is the difference. Truth is always present, but it waits for a voice. You gave it yours." She slid an envelope across the desk. Inside lay a certificate bearing Clara's name, and a small stipend far greater than Clara's monthly wage. Clara touched it with trembling hands. "Use it," Eleanor said, "not as payment, but as recognition. And know this, wisdom does not hide behind titles. Sometimes it comes from the humblest places." That night, Clara returned home and placed the certificate beside her mother's old market ledger. She whispered into the quiet room, "Do you see, Mama? The numbers you taught me carried me farther than I dreamed." Her brother's eyes glowed with pride. "You're famous now, Clara." She smiled gently. "No, I'm not famous. I'm free." Weeks later, the bank announced something new. A scholarship fund, created in honor of Clara's mother, who had raised a daughter on honesty and numbers written on scraps of paper. It was called the Hayes Fund for Truth in Learning. It provided schooling for children who, like Clara once had, counted coins carefully and feared they would never belong in places of marble and gold. When Clara saw the name etched into bronze, she wept quietly. It was not her name that mattered. It was her mother's. Her mother, who had stood in the dust of a market stall, insisting that numbers must never be allowed to lie. Richard's name faded from the bank's records. His laughter no longer haunted its corridors. But Clara's legacy grew quietly, not through speeches or wealth, but through the steady testimony of numbers kept honest. She continued her work, still polishing floors, still scrubbing glass. But she carried herself differently. She no longer walked as a shadow. She walked as someone who knew that the smallest voice, when speaking truth, can echo in the largest halls. One evening, as she closed her ledger at home, her brother asked softly, "Clara, are you proud?" She thought for a long moment. Then she answered, "I am grateful. Proud fades, but gratitude lasts." She placed her hand over the worn pages of her own ledger, the one filled not with riches, but with scraps of truth, and smiled. The city outside still measured its wealth in coins and contracts, in tall towers and gilded names. But those who knew Clara Hayes, those who remembered what had happened in the bank's grand hall, measured wealth differently. They measured it in honesty, in courage, in the quiet certainty of a maid who saw what others refused to see. And though she never sought gold, Clara carried something rarer, a value beyond all riches, the unshakable truth that wisdom belongs to anyone brave enough to speak it. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. We may not all carry wealth or power in our hands, but each of us holds a truth, a dignity that no one can take away. Stories like Clara's remind us that even the quietest voice, when spoken with courage, can change an entire world. If this story touched your heart, I'd be deeply grateful if you subscribe to the channel. Every subscription, every comment, every share is a flame that keeps these stories of courage, justice, and humanity alive. Tell me where you're watching from, and always remember, your truth matters, and it is worth more than gold. Thank you, and see you in the next story.